Today, unicorns or black swans? Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, one that is post covering finance and property news. Another Friday, Tarric is with me once again. Hi Tarric, good to see you again.
Hello Martin, how are you, mate?
Yeah, pretty good. I've been battling a bit of a sort of a fluey coldy thing this week, but finally my tubes are clear, so my voice is more back to normal than it was earlier in the week. A few people were wondering what on earth was going on, whether it was AI who'd got me or what.
That's good to hear, mate. I'm glad you're feeling better because there's plenty to talk about.
There certainly is. It's a really complicated situation at the moment. So many different moving parts, so many things going on. It really is quite difficult to separate woods from trees and to try and understand what's going on from a sort of a long-term perspective versus just more volatility. Money markets have been going violently sideways for the last year or so, and many politicians don't seem to me know where they're going at all.
No, you're right. It's a very complex picture, and I think that as you said, with politicians, not knowing, whether they're Arthur or Martha, so to speak, is definitely complicated things a fair bit. And I think, just say, for example, in the US, you've got them running this explosively large deficit. They're running all these various stimulus programs, the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, all of which is spending money. And obviously that's helping to continue to support the economy and helping to keep, inflation higher than it otherwise would be. And here in Australia, the IMF came out recently, and I think it was earlier this week, and they basically said that the RBA needs to raise interest rates higher because all the various infrastructure spending that the states are doing to keep up with population growth is, all that extra tens of billions a year is inflationary.
Yeah, and it is interesting, isn't it, how central banks have, look at the Fed, look at the Bank of England, have all sort of said, well, we think rates probably will have to stay high for longer. We don't need to lift rates further, but we, keep the option open to do that. The ECB pretty much said the same. But the common theme throughout was rates are going to stay higher for longer. And in fact, people now are talking about no relief on interest rates for 1, 2, or maybe even 3 years. And going back to the US, of course, they're still pumping more treasuries into the marketplace. One reason why the yield curve is where it is. But if you look at some of the fundamentals, which is that we've got more debt, particularly, of course, government debt, and the cost of that government debt is continuing to rise. We've got massive floods of migrants sloshing around the place, coming into Australia and elsewhere. And politicians who, well, I feel that, frankly, no leadership, no direction. They're sort of just bobbing along on the surface.
Well, I think the thing is that there is leadership and there is direction. It's just the wrong direction, because there's some very clear choices have been made. The Albanese government has very clearly chosen to entertain this level of migration and to accept the consequences that come with it. Now, I understand that there is an argument to be made that, say, for example, here in Australia, that level of migration is required for, because of labour force issues, because of, workforce issues, etc. But one, I don't buy that argument. And two, ultimately, I think any move like immigration or any government policy in general needs to be considered not in a vacuum of we need X. It needs to be considered in what is the broader backdrop of what's going on and what is going to be the consequences and who's going to be the winners and who's going to be the losers, and be upfront about that rather than just what we're getting now, which is just, oh, whoops, half a million, net overseas migration.
Yeah, and if you go back to the previous election, Alba was sort of talking down migration rather than talking up migration before the election, and yet the lever is pushed hard over. And what I find interesting, Tarric, is that you and I have been talking about migration, and a couple of other people have for quite some time. There's a little bit more discussion now in the mainstream about it and questioning whether it actually does make any sense or not. Slow but sure, but it is interesting that more people seem to be coming around to the question of whether it actually does make sense.
Well, I feel like we've sort of hit a bit of a critical mass in that regard in the last few weeks. You've seen CBA, you've seen other various banks, HSBC, Deutsche, even the RBA, even Lucy Ellis, who was the former assistant governor, came out and basically said migration is driving up rents, which is, obvious, but it's also playing a significant role supporting the housing market. And that's something that you and I have been talking about, and, also copped quite a bit of flack over the course of this year, saying that this was, playing a significant role. And everyone was like, well, you're just wrong about the housing market. It's like, well, yes, because unfortunately, I was silly enough to listen to the forecasts in the mid-year budget from the Albanese government, which were completely in a completely different galaxy to where they were in reality.
Yeah. So clearly, some of the parameters are rather different. It's interesting, of course, that Chalmers last week came out and said things like, well, the RBA's forecasts are, not far off where our own forecasts are, and there's nothing really to see here. But of course, what he's trying to do is to put a bit of moral pressure on the Reserve Bank, who of course meets on Tuesday, and markets are, not universally, but quite a few are actually saying put rates up. As you said, international pressure from some of those big bodies to put rates up. Interestingly, some of the banks have already lifted some of their mortgage rates ahead of next Tuesday's meeting, which is another interesting signal. So higher for longer is the key here. And of course, the higher for longer problem is that it's a timing thing, as we've discussed previously. People get themselves into a cash flow situation, which from a short-term deficit perspective, they can manage. But if it's going to be there for weeks and months and maybe years, then they need a different strategy to be able to deal with it. And I suspect that's now the slippery sliding slope that we're on.
Yeah, this is something that I covered in a Substack article earlier this week. I'll send it to you and get you to put it in the description or a pinned comment. And I think, what I did in that article is I compared the growth in mortgage arrears here in Australia over the last 12 months with the previous US hiking cycle in the run-up to the financial crisis. Now, during that time, the federal funds rate, which is, their proxy for the cash rate, rose from 1% up to 5.25%. Now, what I did is I took a 2-year period from the time that the Fed started raising rates to the time that they finished, and assessed the impact on mortgage arrears. Now, this is obviously the time of the ninja loan, which is, no income. What is it? No income, no job, no assets, no problem. You can still get a mortgage. The era of subprime. Yeah. Yet, despite that era, occurring, and despite the fact that these teaser rates were expiring and they were experiencing a very similar thing to what we're seeing now with the impact of expiring fixed rate mortgages, mortgage arrears only rose by 0.02% in those first 2 years, despite the fact that rates rose by over 4%. By 4%. So I think that that's rather interesting, that these things do take time, even when you have the absolute idiocy and insanity of things like ninja loans and subprime playing out in the background.
Yeah, it does take time. And of course, people who have mortgages and therefore are relying on those mortgages for somewhere to live, the last thing they want to do is to find themselves homeless, particularly with the rental sector so bad. So they're going to do absolutely everything they can to try and find a way through, and that could include extending loans and doing all sorts of things, cutting back on other spending, grabbing other types of loans. We're seeing personal credit writing in some areas too. So there's a lot of moving parts here. And it's interesting because a few people have said to me, well, how come if my measure of stress, which is a very early measure, it's a cash flow measure, is been rising, and it's rising again this month, how come it hasn't translated to defaults and foreclosures and things? And my response is, well, not yet, just hang on and wait. But the other point, of course, is that the banks have been very flexible in terms of trying to help people. In the advertising campaign this week, they're trying to get people to talk to the banks so that the banks can extend the loans and do other things to try and help, because of course it's in the bank's interest as well as consumers' interests. So I think these factors are going to play out. But the thing we can be clear about, Tarric, I think, is that it's not, unless there's a massive collapse in the economy in some way, we're not going to see interest rates coming back anything like to where they were 18 months ago. That was an abnormal situation. And that means that many people are facing years and years of higher interest rates and higher repayments.
Well, I think if you go back and you look at sort of the relative size of cutting cycles, and you sort of extrapolate that out over the circumstances that we find ourselves in. I mean, okay, rates will get cut by maybe 1.5 to 2.5%, and that's sort of like the ballpark range of a normal cutting cycle in relative terms. And that's at the large end. If you talk about the cutting cycles back in the 70s, they were rounding errors really relative to what we've seen more recently in relative terms. So, I think that even though even though there's a lot of questions about how long rates are going to stay high, what's going to happen with a potential recession or a more serious economic downturn, or higher rates driving that downturn, I think that really we aren't going back to where we were before unless, as you say, something breaks, which I think raises some pretty interesting questions for the housing market, because the housing market today does not reflect a 4.1% cash rate. Now, but I think the thing as well is that, it's easy for people to say, oh, well, it should reflect interest rates, but, there's the supply and demand factor. There's the fact that there's so few listings on the market, and that's something that we'll get to in the slides.
Yeah, well, let's move forward then and move into the slides, which you've very carefully prepared for us. And I have to say, this first one is hilarious. Yeah, they don't believe in me either. Talking about a unicorn there, but the central banks are the question. Central bankers.
Yeah, well, I thought that was rather interesting, especially with the RBA coming up on Tuesday, and well, I'm not sure if I believe that they're going to raise rates either. So it's going to be an interesting one. As usual, dear viewers, the charts can be found at avidcom.substack.com, and I would just like to take a very brief moment to say thank you to everyone who has subscribed, who has contributed. It is very, it is just absolutely huge, and I'm very, very appreciative of that. And I recently hit 2,500 free subscribers on Substack, which is a very nice little congratulatory email to get from them. So, we're on the path, and I'm very thankful to be part of the community who has helped me so much going along that path. So without further ado, we're going to get right into the slides. Now, this slide, for a start, it shows that household debt servicing costs are at record highs as a proportion of disposable income. But I have an issue with this particular chart. Now, I don't have an issue with what it's measuring. It's measuring exactly what it says it is. But the issue is that this is the proportion of overall household income being taken up by the servicing of mortgage debt. Now, when you think about that, that's a little bit silly, isn't it? Because over 60% of people don't have a mortgage. So why should their income and their means be counted towards the servicing of someone else's debts? I'm not a huge fan of this metric for that reason.
So let's just be very clear. What we've got here is we've got 1/3 of households actually paying mortgage servicing, right? But the divisor is total households. So in other words, if you want to get a better view of it, you probably need to multiply this by 3, because 1/3 of households actually are paying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And not only that, but if you sort of look at the most affluent of households, in a lot of cases, they're not the ones who have these enormous debts. It's sort of more. And when I say the most affluent, I'm talking about like the one, the top 5, the top 2% of and there's a lot of income there, which obviously distorts things even more significantly. But I think as well that it's just worth noting that this is still a moving target. As more people roll off fixed rates, this metric is going to rise higher, and there's also the possibility of the RBA taking rates higher once or maybe even twice more, depending on which particular pundit you favour.
Yeah, so. There is an argument to say, well, they've measured it consistently over time, so it shows it's going up. So that's sort of not too bad. But it doesn't really give us the full story. One of the reasons why I go into granularity in my analysis is because different cohorts have very different financial structures and very different cash flows, therefore. And the concentration of which households have problems is where the story should be, rather than a total aggregate view.
No, indeed, I concur. And that's something that I think is interesting about this next. This isn't so much a chart, but it's a quote from the AFR, from Pepper Money. And the Pepper Money spokeswoman said recently, unlike many lenders that exclude items from arrears, such as hardship cases, Pepper Money's reporting of arrears has no exclusions. Now, I've got a link to this article in my Substack, which is where all the charts are. But I just think that's interesting, because it raises so many questions about, okay, how many people are actually in arrears?
Yep.
How many people are, seriously doing it tough, but they're just being protected by, from showing up in the totals by extend and pretend. And I think the really unfortunate thing about this is we don't know.
Well, it's a deliberate obfuscation. And there's a couple of reasons for it. One, of course, is that if you have a delinquent loan, then from an accounting perspective, you have to put capital against it. So the banks are very keen not to show delinquent loans and to argue that if somebody's restructured or is in a hardship scheme, then it's managed and therefore it shouldn't be showing. And the second is, of course, that the portfolios that are reported, so for example, the securitized portfolios, where there's more granularity on delinquency, they are hand-picked portfolios. And I would get cross when the RBA sort of quotes this securitized pool as the example. It is not a normal distribution across all types of loans and all types of risk. And so we don't know, and that's a real problem.
No, and I think the thing is that we have a right to know. We have a right that we should know. But yeah, I mean, this is Australia, so it is what it is.
Just look the other way and say everything's fine. Again.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're good at that here.
Yeah.
Okay, now this is one of the main drivers in my view, and this is something that Edwin has been talking about for a very long time, and he's been very, very right about that. I might add, just the depressed state of overall stock on the market has really played a significant role in supporting housing prices since the pandemic. Now, if you look on the left here, this is the latest data from CoreLogic, which shows that there are 84,711 total active listings in the capital cities. Now, if you'll forgive the slightly potato chart on the right there, it's somewhat old and probably been recycled so many different times, it's lost a little bit of its quality. But you can still see that 85,000 listings is what you would normally see during a very, very bad year, during the period that the real estate industry shuts down over Christmas. Normally, you would see well over 95 or 100,000 listings during a more normal year. And if you're talking about going back a little bit further when housing turnover was higher and transaction costs weren't so high, so back to 2012, there listings were at 120,000, so they were almost 50% higher for this time of year than they are today. So I think that this is something that really needs to be taken into account with the whole sort of broader bullish housing argument, because it is something of a sort of one-off phenomenon, unless we're going to have another pandemic which is going to suppress housing listings.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting to ask why listings are so low. And there's a few things going on. The first is, of course, that some people who are sitting on quite cheap mortgages locked in for a period of time don't want to upset the apple cart. We also know that in some cases the listings that are coming on are old investment properties that haven't been looked after and people are trying to get shot of. And we also have, of course, the high migration. So, those that are coming on, there's more interest simply because, of course, we've got more people trying to find anything to buy. But this listing story is a really critical one. Plus, of course, add in the low supply of newly constructed property because we are holding approvals at a very low level. The time to complete a property is blown out because building construction companies are going into liquidation, and materials are still hard to come by in some cases. So you've got all of those factors suppressing the access and availability of property. And then you've got this sort of weird demand factor where you've got people saying, no, I need to try and buy because I can't afford to rent. All of those factors are in there. But the listing story, Edwin is dead right. It's been that for some time. And even now, there's no indication that listings are fundamentally bouncing and recovering and doing all those things that the media were talking about a few weeks ago.
I think that part of the problem, and I think it's probably good if I just get this little slide up here. Now, this is total listings on a granular basis by capital city. Now, I think it really does need to be noted that the metric that CoreLogic uses here is that it compares it to is the previous 5-year average. Now, obviously, the previous 5-year average is going to be impacted by the weak listings around the toward the tail end of the Royal Commission era, because as some of you might remember from that period, property activity was somewhat depressed, and then also the impact of the pandemic for several years, suppressing the number of properties coming to market. So it's already showing something that's already behind the 8 ball of where it should be on a more normal sort of even keel. And then obviously if you put it into per capita terms, it looks even worse. But still, even if you look at cities like Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, places that have the lowest rental vacancy rates and some of the strongest housing price growth, total listing numbers are still a very long way away from even that very depressed 5-year average. Yet if you look at Sydney and Melbourne, they're sort of roundabout reaching the 5-year average at the moment. So, I think that that's probably part of the reason why some of the heat has been taken out of the market in Sydney and Melbourne in recent months, and why it's just sort of, I would say, running out of gas just a little bit. And I mean, I think that if you were to see this under more normal circumstances without all those extra additional purchases being driven by both the direct impact of migration, but then also the impact of the rental crisis, I think we'd be looking at a very different housing market.
Yeah, and it is worth just reflecting. The most recent data showed that Brisbane prices were on the march up, Hobart prices are on the march down. And if you look at the relative positioning of listings in those two capital city areas, you can see there's a big contrast. So it shows you that there is actually some correlation between listings and what happens with regard to price movements.
Indeed, and we'll just go back to the other slide on this. This is just for new listings, but I think it shows nicely that, say for example, you compare, say for example, Brisbane again. You compare Brisbane with Sydney. Now, obviously, generally speaking, if you go back a couple of years, Brisbane was obviously much, much cheaper than Sydney. It tended to have less, people would have, smaller mortgages relative to their incomes. So there's less pressing need for someone in Brisbane to sell a property compared with someone in Sydney in terms of, getting into trouble. Yet if you look at the chart, you see that in Sydney is one of the relatively few capital cities where new listings are, a decent clip above the 5-year average. And I think that's going to be really interesting to watch going forward, because Sydney, as you can see from the start of the chart there, was one of the places where listings dropped off the most when sort of owners just clammed up around about, I believe it was toward the end of September last year, and they just stopped listing their properties anywhere near. You can see there in the orange chart for Sydney, the orange line, that it was the first time on record, at least in terms of CoreLogic and REA's records, that there wasn't a springtime boost in listings. Instead, new listings fell, which is just something that was previously unheard of, but now things have normalized. So I think that we're just on that very admittedly protracted path to normalization in some of the capitals.
Yeah, and it will take time to play out. And again, my surveys are saying showing that there are some people who are definitely considering listing into into the post-Christmas and post-New Year period. Interesting that one of the sectors that I see quite a lot of activity now is in the down traders. So people who've got a largish property, still got a mortgage, but are trying to sort of think through how to actually shake that out. So it may well be we will see a bit of a rise in terms of houses, and particularly more upmarket houses coming on after the Christmas New Year period. We'll see. Lots of uncertainty there as well, of course. But I also make the point that the down trader tax breaks, particularly you can chuck a lot of money into superannuation and things like that, is part of the reasoning that some people are saying, well, maybe now is the time. Others are saying, well, I'm not going to do anything because it's too uncertain. I don't know quite what's going to happen, but I'm just going to sit on the sidelines. And there are other people saying, no, I'm not going to list at the moment. I'm just going to stay put. But I will be prepared if things change to put my property in the market. So there are a lot of people sort of keeping a watching brief rather than just looking the other way and not worrying about it at all. A lot of it's to do with uncertainty.
It's going to be interesting in that regard to see sort of what moves the needle, because there is a lot of uncertainty, not just about the property market, but about the economy, about, how things are going to play out from here, even just what sort of policies the government is going to pursue in the new year and how that's going to impact, the average, everyday person. So it's going to be fascinating to see how that sort of plays out for the from a psychological perspective for these prospective vendors, because if we do start to see perhaps a little bit more evidence of a more significant headline GDP downturn, or perhaps a little bit more of a wobble overseas, perhaps that could bring some more stock to market.
Well, watch with interest, but I think the key to the property market is definitely listings and migration.
No, I concur. Okay, speaking of migration, I went through all of the available data from the Department of Home Affairs and basically worked out where the trend was for different times. Now, if you go all the way back to the start of the data, I believe, which is 2011 and 2012, we are well above. We are about 150,000 people above where the long-term trend suggests we should be. However, if you start the trend from the time that temporary visa holder numbers were really starting to get ramped up from 2017 onwards, all of a sudden you find that we are almost bang on the trend of where we would have been had the borders never closed and everything remained relatively the same as it was before. So, I think that this just goes to show that there's really been a pursuit by policymakers to just get back to that arbitrary line because, reasons, the housing market, the economy, and, they've had a bit of justification for it, and some people are buying that.
Yeah, and of course it goes back to top-line GDP growth, right? Because GDP and more people tend to travel in the same direction.
Yeah, and I mean, it's kind of crazy when you think about it, because like as the data that came out today showed, you end up with issues with productivity. You end up with productivity declining, and I mean, I'll get it for you, and I'll just get you to whack it up on the screen. But if you compare US productivity versus Australian productivity based on GDP per hour worked, Australia's productivity is back at 2015 levels, whereas US productivity is about 11% higher than where it was in 2015. And I think that that's just really fascinating, because if you think about how much it has been added to Australia's GDP purely through the explosive growth and genesis, really, of the large-scale LNG industry that has occurred during that 8-year period, think about how much worse it would look without that.
Absolutely. Well, the GDP story is, I think, one of the real sleepers in the Australian context, right? There's been no evidence of any GDP improvement in recent times, and the GDP per capita number continues to go backwards. but the top line GDP is saved by pumping more people into the system, and you get more tax, you get more transactions because more people actually are involved in the system, as it were. But of course, where do you put them all is the key question, and what is the quality of life that you create as a result of it?
Indeed, and it's also the question of what happens to that aggregate demand. That's a point that that a lot of economists have been making over the last few weeks, and I feel like there's a growing critical mass over this particular issue, in the sense that when you're running such a large migration program that is, where you end up with population growth in excess of 2%, that's inflationary. Now, there's obviously issues in terms of, what sort of incomes are they going to have. There's obviously issues with granularity, but just purely from a rather simplified mechanical perspective, it is inflationary. Now, on a longer term basis, there's probably it's probably deflationary in the long term, just because it will suppress wages rather significantly, growing the working age population by such a large number. But in the short term, there is that inflation issue, and that's something that we're increasingly seeing from Westpac, CBA, AMP, you name it. There are people raising this issue, and there's even people within Labor now, like backbenchers coming out recently who are also raising issues with migration in various different ways. So, I hope that we can keep the debate on the straight and narrow and keep it focused on policy and the government and not on the individual migrants.
I agree with that. Did you see the Leith Van Onselen analysis the other day? He did it, I think, on Macro Business. He showed that one of the fallacies is that migration means that the population average age is declining. It actually is not. It's not happening like that. So what we're doing is we are actually bringing people into the country and a very similar distribution to those already in the country. So there's actually no relativity in terms of actually bringing younger relatives to older people in, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, and the ironic thing is that if you actually sort of do the math on that as well, and you factor in what proportion of the population is at any given time is, say, for example, in a student or a graduate or any number of other young people who are counted towards the population, it would be even higher without them. So it's a bit of a mess in that regard. And to be completely honest with you, there's a lot of elements of the pro-migration, sort of narrative that just don't add up. Like it improves GDP per capita, or it improves, household disposable income per capita, which it doesn't. And I think allow me to rephrase that. That was phrased poorly. It doesn't under the current circumstances, and it hasn't for the better part of a decade. During Australia's previous immigration settings that we saw, basically from World War II all the way through to, the early 2000s, migration did contribute to productivity. It did contribute. It helped provide skilled people in the right numbers at the right time to support the economy, to support growth, to support productivity, to do all those different things that it's supposed to do. It just doesn't do that when you increase it to such a degree and you change the makeup of it from what was previously optimal. And this is something even that Labor's recent inquiry, its own little paper into migration, found that and I quote, the makeup of Australia's immigration intake is wrong.
Indeed. Well, it's a debate that needs to continue to be propagated on the right basis, as you say, rather than actually just falling into a debate about individuals. There is a policy set of assumptions and a policy set of settings which politicians have put in place for quite some time, driven, of course, by Treasury and their view of the world as well. But the net impact on ordinary Australians is, I think, negative.
I would agree. I mean, I think the thing is that you can at the very least conclude that it is a net wash. If you look at, say for example, you just pick a metric that actually represents how households are varying, say real household disposable income per capita. Now, if it was playing that role that it has historically in boosting productivity, boosting wages, boosting, basically, the broader economy, then you would see that positivity, that positive feedback loop that we've seen in the past, but we're not seeing it. And I think that that it's sad because in a way I feel like it poisons the debate around immigration and around the fact that that there are people who can come here who can enrich the economy, who can enrich our society, but they're just not doing it the right way because they've departed from the sort of what would you call it? Just the sort of more evidence-based, more outcome-based approach that was taken in the now frankly distant past.
Yes, of course, the building and construction sector saying bring more builders in to build more houses for the migrants who are coming in, right? Which is that sort of wonderfully recursive argument. I'm afraid that we need a more mature debate than that, I think.
Indeed. This is just a quick one from CBA that they put together in a recent report, and basically it's just what migration looks like over time, and I think it just basically just goes to show that there is a fairly solid chance that when they release the figures for the second quarter population growth, that net migration will exceed for the last 12 months 500,000 people.
It's a shockingly big number. Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, considering that we were looking at sort of like 200, 250-ish not that long ago, it's a fairly major departure.
Yeah, and I guess the question also is, Tarric, how long those settings will stay. In other words, are we going to see 500,000 this year, 500,000 next year, or is it going to come down? Now, the long-term projections that I've seen suggest that they are expecting it to come down a little, but the question is, will it? And can we swallow the elephant?
I think it will come down. I think we're starting to see higher rates of visa refusals. I mean, that's admittedly from a very, very high base, and we are starting to see a backlash forming against the policy, both in the broader community and within Labor itself. And I think it's very much going to depend on how things evolve politically, because if the Liberal Party does take this issue and run with it, and does make it into sort of like the big election issue, and link it to all the various issues that it's all the various shall we say negative consequences of the outside immigration approach that the Albanese government has taken, then it's going to be very difficult for them to maintain it at anything like the current rate. I mean, honestly, what I expect, my sort of base case in all this is I expect them to reduce it, but it to still end up being around pre-COVID record highs. Because that way they can say, well, we listened, look at what we did. We reduced immigration by 40%. But in actual fact, it's still going to be too high, and it's still going to be playing a significant role in, sort of boosting the headline economy. And there's also just going to be the ongoing issues with, are we going to be able to create enough jobs to keep up with that level of working age population growth at a time when rates are high and there's a possibility of a global downturn on the horizon.
Sounds like another announceable just around the corner there, Tarric.
Yeah, I mean, I did start out as a political journalist many moons ago, so yeah, I understand the way the politician mind thinks, and to be honest, it'll probably work for a while.
Yeah. Whether
it's going to work until the next election, well, that's another question.
Indeed.
Okay, now I like this chart from Seek because it shows that the jobs that we are creating are not really that great. The jobs that, as things currently stand today, there are 15% fewer job ads for jobs in the highest 20% by income than there were before the pandemic. 2% higher for the next 20%. So that's between the 60th and 80th percentile. So I just think that this just really goes to show that it's all in good to say, well, look, there's all these jobs, there's all these ads, this is great. But if you look at the sort of historic numbers there that go all the way back to their 2012, they used to, sort of stay within a relatively decent range of each other. But that's not what's happened. There is a lot of demand for low and middle income labor. So this isn't sort of your sort of traditional booming labor market. It's actually, once you get into the granularity, it's actually sort of more than a little bit two-speed.
Yeah, and quite a few of the jobs that are there at the moment are in the health and caring sectors, and a lot of part-time jobs, and a lot of jobs that are effectively just much lower paid. And what I find interesting, and because again in my surveys I'm seeing people grabbing more jobs, a lot of them are doing additional part-time jobs, but they're actually incrementally relatively unimpressive in terms of the income contribution that they make, but they're actually making a small contribution. So there are many more people who are actually picking up whatever they can find. And of course there was a bit of an argument from some of the industry sectors saying, well, bring more migrants in because that means that we can keep our jobs bill down a little bit because we can actually afford to pay a little less for some of those. So it's maybe a connection back to the migration question as well.
Well, I think so. I mean, it's clear that there is demand in the labor market for low-wage workers. And the problem is that if you're a low-wage worker, it's increasingly hard to put a roof over your head, pay the rent, or be able to get a mortgage. So, I think that, as a society, we've really just shot ourselves in the foot in that regard. And part of the issue as well is that the more that these jobs can be filled by migrants, the less upward pressure there will be on wages. And that's something that Governor Lowe has talked about extensively, which I commend him for. He spoke a lot about the impact of migrants diluting, was the word he used, wage pressures. And you saw during the pandemic that low-wage people actually saw some fairly decent wages growth during that period, and now that wages growth is unfortunately fading.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and kudos to Lowe for calling that out. Be interesting to see whether the new governor has the same intestinal fortitude to call out some of those policy issues or whether actually she'll sort of focus more narrowly on some of those other issues. We'll have to watch this space, I guess. Or maybe we'll see something next Tuesday. Who knows?
Yeah, well, we will. I mean, I think we'll know a little bit more next Tuesday. If the RBA doesn't hike next Tuesday, there's going to be all sorts of questions about to what degree did Chalmers' comments influence Bullock. Now that's not just sort of a tinfoil hat theory. This is front headline AFR stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the head of the Treasury sits on the Reserve Bank board that actually will make the call with regard to rates, and I think he sort of indicated that he wasn't up for a rate rise. And of course, the deputy governor hasn't been appointed yet, so her numbers are down as well.
Well, it's going to be interesting to watch, isn't it? I mean, to be honest, I'm really curious to see if they're not going to pull the trigger, because there's part of me that thinks that they won't. That they're just going to try and bluff their way through and hope that the wheels fall off elsewhere in the world and that they get away with it. And maybe they will.
Yeah, we shall see. Next Tuesday will be interesting.
Okay. Now, I'm going to take a step into the utter minefield that is the stage 3 tax cuts debate and look at this from a purely mathematical perspective. Now, if people want to debate about this in the comments, they can feel free, but this is purely going to be a mechanical look at this, not a political one. Basically, the stage 3 tax cuts will be the equivalent of roughly a 1% cut in interest rates as of July next year. So that is going to be a fairly decent boost to inflationary pressures through additional household consumption. So I think that that's something that needs to be kept in mind going forward, particularly given that we have issues with entrenched inflation, with electricity prices and services and a few other different things, and in particular rents. And there's also some very recent signs that we could see some entrenched inflation at an above RBA target level, also in the new home building sector. And if that were to happen, well, it's going to be very, very difficult to justify a cut in rates next year if that ends up being the case.
And I would make the point, Tarric, that a lot of that additional money will flow to households with smaller mortgages or no mortgages, rather than to those with mortgages or indeed rental problems. So from a distribution perspective, what it is actually doing is flowing income to a sector of the economy that is probably least requiring it at the moment.
Yes, if you were to look at it purely from, you say, for example, you look at a demographic breakdown, this is going to flow generally to, overall, it's going to flow heavily towards older households with more mature careers and higher incomes. And it's going to have, that extra. And the question as well is that, part of the issue with assessing this tax cut and its inflationary impact is a lot of the analysis is pre-COVID. It, assumes things like this is going to be invested, or that this is going to be sat on, or it's going, to something like that. But considering the sort of affluent consumer YOLO, or for want of a better expression, this could be significantly inflationary. So it's just going to be interesting to see what ends up happening in that regard. And, and not only that, but as we get closer to their implementation, as it becomes clear the challenges that other government services and other aspects of the budget are going to face, especially just with the issue of rising costs, it's going to be interesting to see how they sell this to the electorate, because at the end of the day, they're going to end up pissing someone off.
That's right, and of course they'll say, well, it was an election promise, etc., and all of those things. But things have changed, right? The economics have changed, interest rates have changed, the imperatives have changed, and I come back to this horrendous situation where, according to my latest surveys, half of mortgage holders are now having cash flow issues, and more than 70% of renters are having cash flow issues. Those are higher than ever numbers in the history of Australia, which suggests to me that the settings are not necessarily appropriate and correct.
I think if there was to be sort of a message for regular everyday people, who are just trying to pay the mortgage, who are just, sort of median earners, is that the government's realised, that that they can run the economy without you, without me. Yeah. Without without a lot of regular everyday people. If we just get out there and we buy the basics, and we just save our pennies and pay our mortgages and pay our rents, there is enough consumption now at the more affluent end of the spectrum to keep the economy going. And if you throw in things like migration, it's enough for the economy to perform relatively decently under more normal circumstances. So to be completely honest, I'm quite concerned about the message that this reality is going to send, not just Anthony Albanese and the Labor Party, but just the political class in general of, hey, we can get by without needing decent economic outcomes, because it was fine for the last 15 years to throw everyone under 35 under a very large bus, and see, their consumption growth tank into utter oblivion as they tried to save up for a house, as they tried to compete with an increasingly large pool of labour, and saw, real wages growth go backwards. So, I'm quite concerned about what decisions they're going to make as a result of this.
Yeah, and it does go back to those fundamental questions, which is, what's the economy for, and who are politicians concerned about, other than getting back into an elected position, of course. But the net of all of this is that decisions are often taken that don't necessarily affect positively, those sort of middle Australians, those who are actually, are working hand to mouth, particularly with the cash flow pressures today, with inflation where it is and all the other costs we've been discussing. And I just feel that there's like a sort of disconnect between the political class and what they're up to and the rest of the world. And by the way, in the UK, it's exactly the same. So there's a very similar sort of set of dynamics. There's a group of people who are still doing relatively well and feel that they're actually entitled and privileged and can do what they want to do. But there's a lot of other people who would say, well, it's not working for me. And this not working for me story, has a very significant potential to change the political landscape eventually.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's going to eventually lead to the rise of populism. Either the Liberal Party is going to jump on that bandwagon to try and get back into office, or it's going to eventually be someone else. And I think that we're going to see that more and more around the world, in the Western world in particular, especially in these countries where things are not being run in an egalitarian way. I mean, they're being run in a rather sort of, what would you call it? A rather corporate-like way. Very much of, we have this goal, we have this target, and we don't really care how we achieve it. I should rephrase that. A sort of Wall Street corporate way. And when I say Wall Street, I'm referring to the film. Yep. Sort of greed is good sort of approach.
Yep. No, that's right. Well, those values, which are still espoused by many, can benefit some, but not benefit all. And, the greater good question comes to mind, in my view. And there is actually a very important question about how we actually have a standard of living and a standard of societal support that is appropriate for the great majority of people. And I guess maybe I'm slightly idealistic here, but to my mind, it's benefiting the majority, not the affluent minority. That should be the story.
No, I think you probably know by now that I largely agree with you. So, okay, well, get on to this is a good slide that basically just shows that domestic services inflation is becoming entrenched. Now, this is one of the hardest types of inflation to kill. Once it's into the domestic services sector, you've got a problem. And, well, it is. And even on a 6-month annualized basis, which people like doing, it's above 6%. And, okay, it's probably going to moderate in time as eventually demand begins to fall away. But how long is that going to take? Sorry, go.
I was going to say, what's interesting is just what a significant proportion of the CPI basket this now relates to.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think that we've just reached this point now where you're seeing this entrenched inflation. And, okay, it's 21% of the CPI basket, but even if it stays at, say, let's call it something relatively smaller, say around 4.5%, that's enough there for 0.8 to 0.9% headline GDP for these items alone. So it's not going to. You combine that with a few other bits and bobs that are already entrenched. You've got a bit of a problem.
Yeah, and add in the rental growth, which is still not gone away, and the building and construction costs, which are still quite strong. Plus, of course, you've got the electricity and gas price issue and the oil price issue and the exchange rate issues of importing inflation. And you can quite quickly see why it is that inflation is unlikely to get back to the 2% target. And, of course, the RBA probably will have to reforecast higher inflation for longer when they publish their next numbers.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see what those numbers end up looking like, because I have a feeling that they might put a spanner in the works of a couple of people's plans.
I think you could well be right.
Now, this, I think, is a good one of the lag in the rental component of the CPI. Now, a while ago, I put together all the various different asking rents data from Domain, SQM, CoreLogic, REA, etc. And I plugged them all into a spreadsheet, and I tried to work out which one tracked the CPI the strongest. And what I found was that the one that tracked it the best was domains data. Now, domains data just hit a new peak for rental price growth in their latest quarterly report. And this basically shows the ABS CPI rental component lagged 18 months against the domain numbers. Now, you saw an outsized increase in rental assistance recently, which, as you can see, slightly distorted things. But once you account for the impact of that additional subsidy, you can see that it tracks pretty strongly. So if this relationship continues to hold true, we are still 18 months away from the peak impact of rising rents on the CPI. And considering the fact that pressure on the rental market is going to continue for at least another 12 to 18 months at least, that means that rental inflation is going to remain entrenched in the CPI for quite some time to come, especially if the CPI is reweighted and then you end up seeing a greater weighting being allotted to the rental component.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Did you see that the last reweighting actually reweighted everything away from some of those and took account of the rise in international travel, which happened to drop. So that helped the numbers. So if they do a reweighting the other way, which they probably should, given how much people are actually spending on their accommodation costs, that would actually, again, increase the inflation number. So I am of the view that the chances of getting back to that 2% target is getting less and less likely given the current settings. And wherever you look, there are just, under the hood, there are more elements potentially pushing in the same direction, which is up rather than down.
Yeah, it's really, quite a mess because, and I think it's just worth noting that we are one of relatively few countries in the world who have this problem. If you look at most of Europe, if you look at the US, rents are moderating in some cases, especially in parts of the US where you've seen record levels of multifamily home construction very, very quickly. Whereas here in Australia, we're still 18 months away from the peak impact, let alone the end of the impact. So I think that Australia, New Zealand, Canada, we're all out on a bit of a limp together because our inflation problems are not that are stemming from this particular component of the CPI are not going to go away anytime soon. And considering the mechanisms by which this is being driven, by the fact that it's generally not driven by wages and it's mostly driven by the supply-demand imbalance, even a recession or a downturn, which would normally kill wage growth-driven rental inflation, it may not have that effect. So you could end up with a stagflationary scenario where you still have these vital components of the CPI, like new home construction and rents still rising, even though the economy is going down the gurgler. And that is really a quite serious concern.
Well, let's just draw the obvious connection. High migration drives rents up because people come in and then need somewhere to go. High migration driven by high immigration is interest rate insensitive. So therefore, you can put interest rates up more, RBA, and you won't actually make any impact on the rental story. And in fact, you might actually reduce supply rather than actually increase supply of rental, which could actually put more upward pressure on rents. The only lever to deal with an inflation-led thrust from high migration is to turn migration down.
Well, I think the problem is that even if there was the political will to take that particular path, at this point, it's in terms of actually addressing it in a way that's actually going to, have an impact on the CPI anytime soon. That ship has sailed. If this relationship ends up being correct, it's going to be potentially, it's going to be 2025 before we start to see downward pressure, and that's if the Albanese government were to start, significantly reducing migration tomorrow, which isn't going to happen.
Yeah.
So, we're really, more so than the overwhelming majority of other countries in the world, trapped in this inflationary scenario, and I'm not really sure how we escape. I mean, I guess there is the sort of, if things go badly enough, all the other components will get smashed hard enough that you'll end up with an inflation figure that's in target anyway. But I think people who are hoping for that particular outcome and hoping for the rate cuts that come with it, it may be a case of be careful what you wish for in that regard.
I agree. Yeah. Well, it's certainly, I think, highlighting again, one, the complexity, as we touched on at the start of the show, and two, the fact that many of those levers are actually not directly correlated to interest rate changes. There are lots of other levers that have actually created the problem in the first place and will continue to create it. I think it's baked in. So I think we're going to see these higher inflation numbers for quite some time. And that's going to put more difficulty, of course, across the broader economy. Interestingly, in some other places, inflation is more under control than in Australia. So maybe we're slightly later to the party. A number of people said, well, Australia is unique and different. Well, maybe it is unique and different, but not in a good way.
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much, mate. Okay, now this is the chart that was missing from last week, so I won't go into it too long, but basically it just shows that for the mortgage holders who have high loan-to-income ratios and high LVR loans, the probability of these particular mortgage holders finding themselves in rather significant trouble with their required mortgage repayments and basic requirements exceeding their cash flow. And this is and it's also just worth noting that this is based on the household expenditure measure, which is the median spend on the absolute basics and a discretionary spend in the 25th percentile. Now, for those of you wondering, the income for the 25th percentile is $847 a week. Now that's total gross income, not the amount that you can spend on discretionary spending. So it gives you sort of an idea of how low this assumes discretionary spending actually is.
Yeah, well, I've said for some long time that the HEM is a Mickey Mouse formulation that's designed more to allow the banks to do what they want to do rather than actually taking any real reflection of real households and real spending. And, there are judges that have said, well, of course, some households will change their behavior. They'll give up on the steak and eat other things, right? The point is, of course, is that for many households, I see it in my surveys, they're really up against it now because they've got no runway left.
Yeah. No, I think, I think that it just makes some assumptions that aren't really realistic. It's just, but at the end of the day, this is the metric that's been chosen and held up in court for reasons that I don't really understand, truth be told.
Protecting the banks and protecting their lending and showing that they're all doing the right thing, of course.
Okay. Now, this one I'd actually like to ask you about, Martin, because it basically shows that as a proportion of gross household income, rents since the end of 2021 to June 2023 have only risen by 2% of household income. Do you know what rental metric they're actually basing that on? Because I don't get it.
No, I saw that slide the other day and I tried to decode it and I found it impossible. I couldn't reconcile any of this stuff. Of course, part of the issue is the basis of when the data was taken, I suspect. But it does seem to be a bit myopic. I just, no. The short answer is I could not decode this into anything that was useful.
Yeah, no, neither could I. No. I didn't get it. No. I mean, a 7% increase, if you take into account the increases seen in the CPI now, obviously the CPI doesn't reflect, I'll give you an example. This is for the viewers. In terms of the rental component of the CPI, since December 2019, it has risen by 9.4% across Australia. If you compare SQM's data over the same period, it has risen by 44%, more than fourfold what the ABS has seen. So this perhaps, I don't know if this is using the ABS data, but if it is, it's obviously understating rental price growth to a fairly significant degree. And to be honest, this chart and this entire narrative just rubbed me the wrong way of, well, if you think about how much households are earning in terms of the fact that they've taken on extra hours and all these other things in order to make extra money, they are earning more if you compare that as a wages growth proxy rather than using the actual, I don't know, wages price index. And it's like, you're a central bank, for God's sake. You shouldn't be cherry picking like that, but they are.
Yeah. I think cherry picking is precisely the way that I would interpret this, which is to look for the very possible most, extreme positive story that you can construct off selected data, and then argue it in a way that makes it so opaque that nobody can actually pull it apart. Let me tell you that the data from individual households is a million miles from this, as I see in my surveys on an ongoing basis. And not just me, but Roy Morgan, who again reported their stress up again. Wherever you look, the truth is that there are many households that are actually in difficulty. And I guess the other point, again, with all of this stuff, averages mask as well, right? So, taking an average number for the whole of whatever is missing the outliers, because we know that there are some people doing it okay, very okay. We also know that there are others who are not. And so it should actually be shown on a distribution basis rather than just on an aggregated average number, particularly when you can't actually defend the basis on which the numbers are actually created in the first place.
Yeah, I saw it and I was just confused and just thought, well, look, let me put it this way. I wouldn't want to have to defend this particular narrative to the death in a pub in an area in the urban fringe and tell all the renters that they're better off than they were before because they work more hours and that their rents haven't really gone up all much. Yeah, I would not want to have to defend that in front of a bunch of angry middle Australians. It would end badly.
It would end badly, and the real life lived experiences of many households are completely different from that. They are definitely up against it. They're making hard trade-off decisions. They're spending stuff on things they have to spend money on rather than the things they want to spend money on. Their discretionary spending has gone through the floor, and they're still not being able to get things like dental treatment and other things sorted out. So I'm afraid that the real lived experiences of real ordinary Australians is like, RBA, Martin Place, wake up.
I just think it's funny that they literally just had an inquiry into all of this, and one of the things that they said is that they needed to communicate better. And then they come out with this.
Yeah,
it's like, are you just deliberately trying to alienate large proportions of the population?
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, I have to say that central banks around the world have the same problem, but the RBA has a particular problem because they are so disconnected from the reality, the lived experience of many ordinary Australians. And again, what I keep coming back to, if you average everything up, and if you find particular perspectives that manage to tweak the story in a particular way that says, see, there's no problem, then what you're doing is just walking further and further away from the reality that most people are actually experiencing.
Yeah, unfortunately. Okay, now this is the last slide for the day, and this is actually the first time in a while that we've actually managed to get through all the slides, so hooray for us. What I've done here is I've taken the median household income of all the various different 5 major capitals. I've then extrapolated the various wages growth on top of that to give a rough figure for the middle of this year. And then I've plugged that into a mortgage calculator I put together and basically hit it with the average payable variable rate from the RBA's data. And this just shows what priced home a household of a median income in all the various cities can actually afford to buy. Now, the first one, The first scenario in the green is based on the borrowing power of what a bank, one of the major banks, will let them borrow, through their mortgage calculator. And the one on the right in the blue is what they can borrow and still not be in technical mortgage stress, which is having 30% or more of their gross income consumed by debt servicing. And I just think it's just rather remarkable to see just how small the budget is for the median household to actually buy a home under the current circumstances.
Yeah, the truth is that the borrowing power of a typical household has dropped now somewhere between 40 and 45% from where it was. And the loan-to-income and loan-to-value ratios are also off as well, of course, because of what's happened. And that means that less and less people can actually afford to buy anything on the typical incomes that they have, which is meaning that it pushes people right out to the urban fringe or to buy a unit rather than a house, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, and to Brisbane to an extent. And it shows you, I keep coming back to the fact that house prices relative to income are way off the scale. In fact, there's a very important chart that shows the relationship between average incomes and average house prices across Australia, but it shows you that we're way off kilter. And so if you want more evidence that we're actually in an unsustainable situation, then Tarric, the slide that you've shown here, really just, again, it makes the point. It's impossible for ordinary people to be able to get a property in areas where they want to live. And that shows you that there is something structurally wrong with the way that the housing and the economy is working.
Yeah, I actually was lucky enough to get into contact with REA about this. And what I asked them was, I gave them all my figures and I said, okay, with the maximum borrowing power scenario, what proportion of listings is affordable for this median hypothetical, two-person household? And only 2% of Sydney's three-bedroom or more houses were affordable for the median earning household. Now that's ridiculous. If you look back to the mid-1990s, a household earning the median income could just about afford the median house without any help, without any parental assistance or anything, and just be able to live their life. But now you can't even afford, more than, I believe it was 61% of two-bedroom or more units were unaffordable.
Yep.
The ones that are currently listed for sale were unaffordable for someone on a median income. That is just, it's just silly.
Yeah, it's silly, and it shows you just how far off-piste house prices have gone, and all sorts of reasons why: loose lending standards, government stimulus, incentives, all of those things. But the net is that the property market is severely broken, and unfortunately, the critical discussion we should be having about how to really fix the property market is not a discussion that politically anybody wants to have.
I think that the truly sad thing is it's not just about the unwillingness to have the conversation. I understand that to a degree. I understand that nobody wants to be the person who's seen to prick the bubble, so to speak. But there were other paths that the government and that Anthony Albanese could have taken that would have seen property prices fall back to, perhaps pre-COVID levels, perhaps a bit more. Like we've seen in New Zealand, where property prices, in some places fell by more than what they did during the US at an aggregate level during the financial crisis. Yet a different set of policies was pursued to put a floor under the housing market, which has then affected everyone else, whether it's through the impact of the rental crisis or whether it's through the impact of weaker wages growth or just weaker per capita outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the bottom line, of course, has been protect financial stability, protect the banking system at all costs. The best way to do that is to not let property prices fall. The best way to do that is to keep jawboning prices higher and to throw more incentives at people. Never mind the fact that less and less affordable housing exists, and then play with announceables around the edge that are relatively meaningless to show they're really doing something when they're not. That's the story. Pure and simple.
Yeah, sadly so. And it's a shame, and I think part of the problem is that you've got this issue whereby you see housing prices go up 15, 20, 25, 30% in a year. And all of a sudden there's this, what's the word? This groundswell of this requirement that those gains need to be defended. Yep. That we can't just go back to the way things were at the end of 2019 and just go, oh, well, wages and inflation went up a bit, so maybe housing's a little bit more affordable now. But most of the overwhelming majority of you are not going to be in negative equity, and we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Like if we had have seen the sort of, 20, 25% down scenario that we saw in New Zealand, which would have, sort of roughly seen us, depending on the city and the locale, roughly seen us back down towards pre-COVID levels. And, maybe a little bit more, it would have been a bit more affordable than it was previously. But we couldn't have that, could we?
No, we couldn't have that. No, that would have been much, much, much too logical, and all for all sorts of reasons. So, once again, we're in this, really weird land. The title of this was, swans and black swans and unicorns. Well, we're in this land of unicorns at the moment, still believing, still holding on to the belief that property will only ever go up, that the government will always save us, and the interest rates are going to get cut and cut fast and hard, which means that we can keep this going on for another few years. The truth, the reality is extremely different, as we've seen in the show today, Tarric, and it's time for politicians to wake up and realise that we need a new political narrative and a new set of strategies, but I'm not holding my breath.
No, neither am I. I mean, really, we need a strategy to deal with a China that's no longer reliant on its property sector. But that, I think, is a rather complex topic that will require a series of charts and for another program.
Sounds like we should meet again soon, Tarric, and have another explore. Well, thank you very much for your time today. Really appreciate it. Thanks for all the work on the slides. Comments and things are below, and the links to all the various sources of slides. And I'll look forward to the next conversation as soon as we can do it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it, mate.
Take care. Have a good evening. Cheers. Bye-bye.
See you, mate. Bye.